Aspley Guys, England, May 23, 1941, 4:50 in the afternoon. And inside a discreet red-brick Victorian mansion called the Rookery, a man sits before a microphone, preparing to speak words that will echo across the Third Reich like a bomb blast through carefully controlled silence. Peter Zettelmann, a former Berlin detective story writer who fled Nazi Germany and was plucked from a bomb disposal squad just weeks ago, clears his throat and waits for the signal. He wears no uniform, sits in no military installation, but what he's about to do will prove more dangerous to the Nazi war machine than a squadron of bombers. The words he speaks will be heard by millions of German soldiers and civilians, will drive the Gestapo into a frenzy of searching, will cause Hitler's inner circle to suspect treachery among their own ranks, and will demonstrate that the war for hearts and minds can be as deadly as the war fought with bullets and bombs. In exactly 10 seconds, Peter Zettelmann will become der Chef, the chief, the voice of Gustav Siegfried Eins, and the Third Reich will never be quite the same again. The British political warfare executive understands something fundamental about propaganda that the Nazis, for all their expertise in controlling information, have somehow missed. The most effective lies are those wrapped in enough truth to be believable, and the most devastating propaganda comes not from obvious enemies, but from voices that sound like friends. By May 1941, Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany, having survived the Blitz, but facing the very real possibility of invasion. And the traditional tools of warfare, bombs and bullets and brave soldiers, are simply not enough. The Royal Air Force fights desperately in the skies, the Royal Navy struggles to keep supply lines open, and on the ground, Britain prepares for an invasion that seems inevitable. But in the realm of psychological warfare, Britain possesses an advantage the Germans cannot match. A journalist named Sefton Delmer, who knows Hitler personally, speaks German better than most Germans, and understands the Nazi mind with an intimacy that will prove devastating. Dennis Sefton Delmer, known to his friends as Tom, was born in Berlin in 1904 to Australian parents. His father a professor of English literature at Berlin University, and young Sefton grew up speaking German before he spoke English. During World War I, his family was interned by the Germans, an experience that gave the young boy an understanding of German culture that few British citizens could match. After the war, the Delmers returned to England, but Sefton never lost his connection to Germany, and in the 1930s, as a foreign correspondent for the Daily Express, he returned to Berlin and became one of the few journalists to gain access to the inner circles of the Nazi Party. Through Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, Delmer met Adolf Hitler in 1931, interviewed him multiple times, flew with him on his private aeroplane during the 1932 election campaign, and walked through the burned ruins of the Reichstag after the fire that gave Hitler his excuse to seize total power. Hitler once called Delmer his favourite foreign journalist, a grotesque compliment that demonstrates how completely Delmer had penetrated the Nazi leadership while secretly despising everything they represented. When war came in 1939, Delmer returned to Britain and became an announcer for the BBC's German service. But his real talents lay not in traditional broadcasting, but in something far more devious. In September 1940, the newly formed political warfare executive recruited Delmer to organise black propaganda broadcasts to Nazi Germany. Psychological warfare designed to corrode German morale from within. Black propaganda differs from white propaganda in one crucial aspect. White propaganda admits its source, broadcasts from the BBC that clearly identify themselves as British, while black propaganda pretends to come from within the enemy's own ranks. The Germans themselves had used black propaganda effectively during their invasion of France, operating fake radio stations that claimed to be French or British, sowing confusion and panic among Allied troops and civilians. Delmer proposed to turn this weapon back on the Germans, but with a sophistication and psychological insight that would make the German efforts look primitive by comparison. The concept behind Gustav Siegfried Eins was brilliantly simple and devastatingly effective. The station would claim to be an illegal broadcaster operating from within Germany, run by devoted Nazis and old guard Prussian military veterans who loved Germany but had become disgusted with the corruption and incompetence of the Nazi Party leadership. The call sign, Gustav Siegfried Eins, used the German military phonetic alphabet for the letters G and S, suggesting either Geheimsender 1, Secret Transmitter 1, or Generalstab 1, General Staff 1. The ambiguity was deliberate, allowing listeners to imagine the station came from military dissidents or underground resistance, when in reality it broadcast from a comfortable Victorian mansion in the quiet Bedfordshire village of Aspley Guys, about 50 miles north of London. The station's programmes were recorded on glass discs, then transported by courier to powerful transmitters at nearby Gorcott and Pottsgrove, where they were broadcast on shortwave frequencies that German listeners across occupied Europe could receive. Peter Seckelmann, playing Der Chef, adopted the persona of a gruff, foul-mouthed Prussian officer who loved Germany with passionate intensity, but viewed the Nazi Party officials, the Partei Kommune as he called them, as corrupt gangsters who were betraying the nation. The timing of the first broadcast, May 23, 1941, was carefully chosen to exploit one of the most shocking events in Nazi history, the flight of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, to Scotland just 10 days earlier. As Seckelmann sat before the microphone that evening, Delmer had written him lines that no German radio station would ever dare to broadcast. Der Chef's voice crackled across the airwaves with venomous fury as he ranted about Hess, saying that as soon as there was a crisis, Hess packed himself a white flag and flew off to throw himself and us on the mercy of that flat-footed bastard of a drunken old cigar-smoking Jew, Churchill. The language was shocking, obscene, more extreme than anything heard on German radio. And that extremism became the station's calling card. The broadcasts followed a carefully crafted formula that Delmer would later describe as cover dirt, cover dirt. Der Chef would begin by establishing his credentials as a loyal German, attacking Churchill and the British with vicious rhetoric, praising German military victories, expressing devotion to the fatherland. This was the cover, the protective colouring that made listeners believe they were hearing a genuine German patriot. Then came the dirt, the propaganda designed to undermine the Nazi regime. Der Chef would launch into tirades against middle and low-ranking Nazi party officials, accusing them of corruption, cowardice, sexual deviance, profiteering while German soldiers froze to death in Russia. The accusations were specific enough to seem credible, based on intelligence gathered from prisoner-of-war interrogations, resistance reports, and British intelligence sources, and the psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers and civilians hearing these broadcasts faced a cognitive dissonance that shook their faith in the regime. Here was a voice that sounded German, that expressed German nationalist sentiment, that clearly loved Germany, yet was describing Nazi officials as criminals and perverts who were betraying everything Germany stood for. The scripts for Gustav Siegfried Eins were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, crafted by Delmer and his team of German-speaking writers with an understanding of German culture and psychology that went far beyond simple propaganda. Delmer later wrote that he took enormous trouble over Der Chef's erotica, devoting many hours of patient research to finding ever new forms of sexual depravity to attribute to Nazi officials. This wasn't mere vulgarity for its own sake, but a calculated attack on the Nazi Party's carefully cultivated image of moral superiority. The Nazis had built their movement on claims of national purification, on the idea that they were cleaning Germany of degeneracy and corruption. So accusations that Nazi officials themselves were the real degenerates struck at the heart of the party's legitimacy. The broadcasts described Nazis officials involved in rape, paedophilia, theft, cowardice, every possible vice that contradicted the party's propaganda about creating a new moral order in Germany. At the end of each broadcast, Der Chef would read a series of numbers, apparently coded messages for other resistance cells. The first broadcast included a message that, when decoded using a simple cipher, read, "Willi meet Jochen, Friday, row 5, parquet stalls, second performance, Union Theatre." There were hundreds of Union Theatre cinemas across Germany, and Delmer fondly imagined Gestapo agents attending every single one, watching for Willi and Jochen, two agents who existed only in Delmer's imagination. The Gestapo quickly detected that the broadcasts were coming from Britain, using radio direction-finding equipment, but they couldn't ignore the possibility that the coded messages were real, that British agents in Germany were receiving instructions through these broadcasts, and that somewhere in the Reich, a genuine resistance movement was coordinating through Gustav Siegfried Eins. The paranoia this created within Nazi security services became one of the operation's greatest successes, as resources were diverted to hunting for resistance groups that didn't exist, and traitors who were purely fictional. German listeners began tuning in by the thousands, then the tens of thousands, drawn by the forbidden thrill of hearing criticism of Nazi officials on German-language radio. In Nazi Germany, where the press was completely controlled, where radio played only approved news and German folk music, where public criticism of the party was literally punishable by death, Gustav Siegfried Eins offered something intoxicating and dangerous, the sound of dissent. Soldiers at the front, weary of the war and suspicious of official propaganda, found in Der Chef a voice that expressed their own growing doubts. Civilians on the home front, suffering under rationing and bombing, heard their suspicions confirmed that party officials were living well while ordinary Germans suffered. The Gestapo launched massive manhunts trying to find the transmitter, convinced it must be a mobile unit moving through Germany, when in reality, Zeckelmann sat comfortably in the rookery in Aspley Guise, recording his broadcasts in complete safety before they were transmitted from powerful British stations. As Gustav Siegfried Eins gained an enormous audience in Germany, all kinds of theories spread about Der Chef's identity and location. Some believed he broadcast from a barge on the River Spree in Berlin. Others thought he moved constantly through occupied Europe, dodging from hideout to hideout. All theories assigned him primitive, uncomfortable quarters, and portrayed him as constantly on the run from Gestapo raiders when the reality was absurdly different. Had German listeners been able to peek inside the rookery, they would have seen Zeckelmann recording broadcasts in a house with comfortable furniture, a grand piano, spreading chestnut trees in the garden, and the genteel atmosphere of an English country home. The contrast between the imagined reality and the actual circumstances would have destroyed the station's credibility instantly. But this was the genius of black propaganda. The audience supplied their own story, filled in details that made sense to them, and never questioned whether Der Chef really existed. American embassy officials in Berlin, before the United States entered the war, reported to President Franklin Roosevelt about Gustav Siegfried Eins as evidence of growing friction between the Nazi Party and the German military. Roosevelt, who enjoyed wartime deceptions, supposedly laughed when he later learned the truth, delighted that even his own diplomats had been fooled. British Labour politician Sir Stafford Cripps, however, was less amused. When he received transcripts of some of Delma's more sexually explicit broadcasts, Cripps complained that the material was offensive and unsuitable for broadcast even to the enemy. The controversy reached Churchill himself, but the Prime Minister, understanding the effectiveness of Delma's methods, allowed the broadcasts to continue. The measure of success was not whether British politicians approved of the content, but whether German soldiers and civilians believed it and had their faith in the Nazi regime eroded. And by that measure, Gustav Siegfried Eins succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. For 2.5 years, Gustav Siegfried Eins broadcast nearly 700 programs, each one carefully crafted to sound like it came from within Germany, each one designed to drive wedges between the Nazi Party and the military, between party officials and ordinary Germans, between Hitler's inner circle and everyone else. The station's success created problems for the Nazi propaganda ministry, which couldn't publicly acknowledge the broadcasts without admitting they existed and potentially driving more listeners to tune in, but also couldn't ignore a station that was reaching millions of Germans with anti-Nazi messages. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, privately acknowledged that Gustav Siegfried Eins was having an effect, that it was sowing doubt and confusion among Germans, but he had no effective countermeasure. How do you fight a radio station that claims to be more Nazi than the Nazis, that attacks you from the right rather than the left, that uses your own rhetoric against you? In late October 1943, Delma decided to end Gustav Siegfried Eins in spectacular fashion. The station had served its purpose, established black propaganda as an effective weapon, and paved the way for even more sophisticated operations. For the final broadcast, Delma scripted a Gestapo raid on the station, with Der Chef being shot and killed on air, supposedly discovered at last after years of evading capture. The dramatic finale was meant to cement Der Chef's reputation as a martyr, a true German patriot, murdered by the corrupt regime he had opposed. Unfortunately, the recording engineer who broadcast the transcription didn't understand German and played the death of Der Chef twice, a technical error that inadvertently turned the dramatic finale into dark comedy. German listeners heard Der Chef shot and killed, then mysteriously resurrected to be shot and killed again, an absurd mistake that probably raised more questions than it answered. Despite this bungled ending, Gustav Siegfried Eins had proven its concept, demonstrated that sophisticated black propaganda could undermine an enemy's morale, and established Sefton Delma as a master of psychological warfare. Gustav Siegfried Eins was only the beginning. On November 14, 1943, just 2 weeks after Der Chef's dramatic death, a new station began broadcasting, and this one would prove even more effective and far-reaching than its predecessor. Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais, claimed to be an official German military radio station broadcasting to troops in France, and unlike Gustav Siegfried Eins, which used shortwave frequencies, Soldatensender Calais broadcast on medium wave, the same frequencies used by official German stations. This was psychological warfare taken to a new level of sophistication, because broadcasting on medium wave required enormous power, the kind of transmitter that only governments possessed, which made the station seem more legitimate to German listeners, who assumed no one but the German military could broadcast on those frequencies. The transmitter that powered Soldatensender Calais had a remarkable history. The Radio Corporation of America had built a 500-kilowatt monster for station WJZ in Newark, New Jersey, but before it could be installed, the Federal Communications Commission imposed a 50-kilowatt power limit on all American radio stations, making the transmitter useless in the United States. The British Secret Intelligence Service purchased this massive transmitter for £165,000, a fortune in 1943, and installed it in a huge underground bunker near Crowborough in Sussex, England, where it was codenamed Aspidistra. When operational, Aspidistra was briefly the world's most powerful medium-wave station, capable of blasting through German jamming and reaching German troops and civilians across occupied Europe with crystal-clear signals that seemed to come from their own military broadcasting network. Soldatensender Calais broadcast from 6 in the evening until dawn. Programs produced live from a specially built studio in Milton Bryan, Bedfordshire, presented by Agnes Bernell, an Austrian Jewish actress who had fled the Nazis and now used the codename Vicky on air. The programming followed Delmer's proven formula of cover, cover, dirt, but with even greater sophistication than Gustav Siegfried Ein's. The station played popular German dance music, forbidden American jazz and swing, sports reports from Germany, news about the war that was accurate enough to be credible, and as part of its cover, actually broadcast speeches by Adolf Hitler and other Nazi officials. To first-time listeners, Soldatensender Calais sounded like a legitimate German military station, perhaps a bit more entertaining than official broadcasts, with better music and more interesting news. And this apparent legitimacy was the key to its success. But here was the psychological masterstroke that made Soldatensender Calais more effective than any previous propaganda operation. German soldiers and civilians listening to the station knew it was British. The Gestapo knew it was British. German intelligence officers knew it was British. Everyone knew it was British, and the British wanted them to know. Soldatensender Calais wasn't trying to fool anyone about its origin. It was providing something far more valuable than deception. It was providing cover. If a German soldier was caught listening to Soldatensender Calais by an officer or Gestapo agent, he could claim he thought it was a real German station and be believed, because the station sounded so authentic. The psychological cover went even deeper, because it was easier for Germans to accept criticism of their leadership when it was presented as coming from us and about our boys, rather than from an obvious enemy source. And most importantly, the station gave cover to do what many Germans wanted to do anyway: surrender, defect, ignore orders, undermine the Nazi war effort in small ways that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively had devastating impact. The content interspersed throughout Soldatensender Calais programming was designed to demoralize German troops and create paranoia within the military. Broadcasts warned soldiers about confidence men swindling troops being transferred from France to the Russian front, planted stories about party officials profiteering while soldiers died, spread rumors about Allied advances and German defeats before official news sources confirmed them, and provided details about conditions on various fronts that could only have come from inside sources, making German officers paranoid that they had traitors in their ranks. The level of detail in these broadcasts was extraordinary, based on interrogations of German prisoners of war, reports from partisan groups in occupied territories, intercepted correspondence, decoded messages, and dozens of other intelligence sources that Delmer and his team synthesized into believable stories that sounded like inside information. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces launched the D-Day invasion of Normandy, Soldatensender Calais played its most crucial role. At 4:50 in the morning, before official German stations had confirmed anything, Soldatensender Calais broadcast the news that the enemy is landing with force from the air and from the sea. The Atlantic Wall is penetrated in several places. German soldiers heard the news first from what they believed was their own military radio network, not from Allied sources, and this apparent inside information gave it credibility that official broadcasts later in the day couldn't match. Throughout the invasion, Soldatensender Calais broadcast information designed to make German intelligence officers believe the invasion frontage was much wider than it actually was, contributing to German confusion about where to concentrate their forces. The station spread rumours about additional landings, phantom armies, Allied advances that hadn't happened yet, all designed to paralyse German decision-making at the critical moment when rapid response might have made a difference. The audience for Soldatensender Calais grew enormous. Intelligence gathered from prisoner of war interrogations revealed that 41% of German soldiers tuned in regularly, making it one of the 3 most popular stations in major German cities, the equivalent of having a top-rated network show. Even more remarkably, German soldiers and civilians listened, knowing it was British propaganda. Because the entertainment value was high, the news was often more accurate than official German broadcasts, and listening gave them access to information the Nazi regime tried to suppress. SS officials in Munich lamented that Soldatensender Calais had become one of the city's top 3 stations. Goebbels complained in his diary that the station did a very clever job of propaganda, and that from what was put on the air, one could gather that the English knew exactly what they had destroyed and what they had not, revealing his frustration that British intelligence about conditions in Germany was better than his own propaganda could counteract. The success of Soldatensender Calais inspired even more ambitious projects. The Political Warfare Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services began producing Nachrichten für die Truppe, News for the Troops, a newspaper that replicated the radio broadcasts in print form. Allied aircraft dropped an average of 250,000 copies each night before and after D-Day, saturating German positions with propaganda that looked like their own military publications, but contained the same mixture of truth and deception that made Soldatensender Calais so effective. German soldiers found copies in their trenches, read them because they were starved for information, and had their morale further eroded by stories about the futility of continued resistance, the betrayal of German troops by Nazi leadership, and the inevitability of defeat. Otto John, one of the few survivors of the Valkyrie plot to assassinate Hitler and stage a military coup, later told Delmer that the conspirators believed British support for their coup attempt was likely because the British were broadcasting stations like Soldatensender Calais that encouraged a split between the Nazi Party and the military. The conspirators misread British intentions. British black propaganda was designed to weaken Germany, not to support a coup. But the fact that senior German military officers believed Soldatensender Calais indicated British sympathy for military dissidents shows how effectively the station had created the impression of a growing rift between party and military. Hans Fritzsche, the head of Nazi radio, told Delmer after the war that Hitler's closest confidants were so alarmed at the level of detail about German politics in Soldatensender Calais broadcasts that they were convinced someone in the inner circle was leaking secrets to the British, leading to interrogations and paranoia at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. As Allied forces advanced across Europe in 1944 and 1945, Soldatensender Calais adapted its message and its supposed location. When Canadian forces liberated Calais in September 1944, the station seamlessly changed its call sign to Soldatensender West, Soldiers Radio West, claiming to have relocated deeper into Germany, maintaining the fiction that it broadcast from within German-controlled territory. The station continued until April 30th, 1945, broadcasting until the last week of the war in Europe, when it simply fell silent, without any official announcement, its work complete as the Third Reich collapsed around it. For 18 months, from studios in Milton Bryan and transmitted by the massive Aspidistra transmitter in Sussex, Soldatensender Calais had reached into German homes and military positions across Europe, providing entertainment that drew enormous audiences, news that was often more accurate than official German sources, and psychological warfare that undermined Nazi morale with devastating effectiveness. The secret radio stations operated by Sefton Delmer and the Political Warfare Executive represent one of the most successful psychological warfare campaigns in military history, proving that in modern warfare, the battle for hearts and minds can be as important as the battle fought with conventional weapons. Delmer's genius lay not in crude propaganda that anyone could recognize and dismiss, but in sophisticated operations that understood how people think, what they fear, what they desire, what they're willing to believe. By creating radio stations that sounded German, that expressed German nationalist sentiment, that seemed to come from within the Reich itself, Delmer bypassed the psychological defences that Germans had built against obvious enemy propaganda. The stations provided entertainment and information that Germans wanted, then used that audience to deliver messages that corroded faith in the Nazi regime from within. After the war, Delmer returned to journalism, deliberately downplaying his wartime work because he feared unrepentant Nazis would claim they had been defeated by unconscionable methods rather than on the battlefield. This caution created an unintended consequence that Delmer called a black boomerang. Former Nazis claimed without contradiction that they had assisted the fictitious resistance movements described in black propaganda broadcasts, appropriating credit for opposing Hitler, when in reality they had served the regime. The full story of Gustav Siegfried Eins and Soldatensänder Calais remained classified for 50 years after the war, hidden away like the code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park, because the techniques Delma had pioneered were too valuable to reveal. When the files were finally declassified in the 1990s, historians recognized that Delma's operations had influenced military psychological warfare for generations, establishing principles that continue to guide information operations in modern conflicts. The legacy of the secret radio stations extends far beyond World War II. The concept of using enemies' own rhetoric against them, of providing cover so people can act on their own inclinations, of mixing truth with deception in ways that make the deception believable. These techniques have become fundamental to modern information warfare. The genius of Sefton Delma was understanding that effective propaganda doesn't tell people what to think, but gives them permission to think what they already suspect, provides information that confirms their doubts, and creates a narrative that allows them to act on their own best interests while maintaining plausible deniability. The man who had interviewed Hitler, who had travelled with him during his rise to power, who understood the Nazi mind with intimate clarity, used that knowledge to help destroy the regime from within, proving that sometimes the most devastating weapons are not bombs or bullets, but words spoken in the enemy's own voice.